We live in an age where the internet and social media are awash with disinformation and bad arguments. And yesterday, I had an exchange with an apologist for Russia in light of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I wanted to relay our exchange on Twitter because I think maybe it might be helpful for some people to kind of think through how you keep your eye on the ball in terms of argument, keep the main thing, and clear the field, as it were, of bad arguments, distractions, rabbit trails, as you challenge people on bad reasoning and disinformation. So I'll begin with this tweet I posted on February 27th, which, as I make this video, was yesterday. And I said, yesterday at CPAC, Donald Trump took aim at the, quote, tyranny of Justin Trudeau. Now the silly hashtag Trudeau dictatorship must go is trending. Ironically, Trump has a history of praising real dictators like Putin, Xi Jinping, Duterte, Orban, MBS, Kim Jong-un, etc. So I think this is a really important theme because Trump continues, as of right now, in fact, at the CPAC polling on the weekend, he is polling at something like 58 to 60% approval to run for the Republican nomination again among those surveyed at CPAC. Now, CPAC may not be representative of, I think it's the Conservative Political Action Committee, and they're meeting in Florida, and they may not be representative of the wider GOP, although I think by and large, Trump is far and away the lead candidate to run again for president. So to recognize that Trump, in fact, supports dictators rather than opposes them is something well worth keeping in mind. Then I received this response from one person. He says, "This is who Putin is fighting." Now, you may have heard that Putin talked about neo-Nazis when he invaded Ukraine. And that was just widely dismissed as an absurd pretense, a fabrication, an imagination, a thing in his mind, a delusion, a rationalization to simply justify invading, that somehow, quote unquote, neo-Nazis were the problem. It's clear, rather, that what Putin has said on repeated occasions is that he wants to achieve the glory of Mother Russia again. And he greatly, while he's very much a critic of aspects of the Soviet Union, the idea of all of these, the Soviet Empire is something that he really wants to recapture. And that includes regaining control of Ukraine. And so, of course, that began in 2014 with the acquisition of Crimea. And this just fits into that standard playbook. So when he talks about fear of Nazis, well, this is pretty clearly appears to be an absurd assertion, a rabbit trail, a distraction. But this person responds by saying, no, this is who Putin is fighting. In other words, he's affirming Putin is really concerned with Nazis, and that's why he's invading Ukraine, to rid Ukraine of Nazis. So what I did was I did a reverse Google image search for one of these images. And so this is what I came up with. That those are images, and they are real images. They're not fabricated, but they're images of the Azov battalion, which is a battalion in the Ukrainian army. Now, from what I've read, it is a battalion not of neo-Nazis per se, but a battalion that has a significant subset of neo-Nazis. Now, the one statistic I read was up to 20% in the battalion have neo-Nazi sympathies. And I don't know, maybe it's higher, but that's what I read. Nonetheless, it doesn't entail that everybody is in that battalion is going around with SS symbols and swastikas. So I said, these are pictures of the Azov battalion. Your logic is equivalent to trading pictures of the Oath Keepers on the southern border to justify an invasion of the United States. You're spreading Putin's propaganda. In other words, I was saying, this is just not a reasonable justification to invade Ukraine. Now, I don't know if Oath Keepers per se patrol the southern border, but I do know that there are self-appointed militias that work the southern border with Mexico and have worked to pick up, quote unquote, illegals, Mexican nationals and other non-American nationals who are coming from Mexico across the border, attempting to get into the United States. And these militia groups, some of which have some pretty radical right-wing ideas, do work with the US border services and will turn people over to the US border services. And the fact that those relationships exist doesn't mean that the US government as a whole thereby affirms all of the right-wing ideology of some of these militia groups, self-appointed, that are working the southern border. Far less would it justify a general invasion of the United States. It's just an absurd supposition. And I'm arguing that there's an analogy here, that likewise, even though Ukraine has within its army one battalion with a subset of people within the battalion who have neo-Nazi sympathies, does not of itself justify a general invasion of a country of 48 million people. It's just an absurd argument. Well, this is what fringe majority responded. Are they not a registered National Guard unit of the Ukrainian army? Yes, in fact, they are. Your turn. Now, of course, the rhetoric of saying your turn is meant to give his point significant force. In other words, he's given me some really significant argument that I now am obliged to counter. In fact, it's not a significant argument. And adding your turn at the end of his statement is just a piece of rhetorical piffle. The fact, again, that the Azov battalion is a registered National Guard unit in the Ukrainian army, and that battalion has a subset of people with neo-Nazi sympathies, does not of itself indict the entire Ukrainian army, still less the entire country, and warrant an invasion from Russia. It's just an absurd argument. So I wanted now, and this was the point to hammer home on, to hammer home how ridiculous the argument this individual was making is. So I framed it as follows. With respect to specific geography, what I did was I said, okay, the Azov battalion is located in Mariupol. Didn't take long to find that out. How far is Mariupol from Kyiv, where most of the fighting and focus has been? 800 kilometers away, as I'll mention in the next tweet. So I said, they are a single militia stationed in Mariupol, not Kyiv, where Putin has been directing his assault for the last 3 days. Your turn. So I'm flipping now the rhetorical turn of phrase. And then I added immediately, here is a video of Putin bombing a residential apartment building in Kyiv, 800 kilometers away from the headquarters of the Azov, pardon my typo there, Azov battalion. So to summarize, what I'm pointing out there is, again, it's clearly an absurd justification, a rationalization, a ruse, case of motivated reasoning to justify a general invasion of Ukraine, to cite, quote, neo-Nazis in a battalion on the Sea of Azov, 800 kilometers away from Kyiv, where all the fighting is directed. If Putin was really concerned about that specific battalion, well, then he would have targeted that battalion in that city. He would not have directed his forces to go to Kyiv and be bombing civilian apartment buildings. So this individual then replies, what does this have to do with the Ukrainian government officially sanctioning neo-Nazi units in their army? So again, this was this person's one single talking point, that this group with a subset of people who have neo-Nazi sympathies was part of the official government army. It was sanctioned by the government army, and trying to argue that that somehow is like, throw down the gauntlet, drop the microphone. Like, we've established now that Putin has sufficient warrant to justify invading Ukraine and directing all his forces at the capital of Kyiv. Again, it's an absurd argument, and I'm not going to let him get away with that. So I replied by reiterating the significance of the point I had just raised, so that he could not deflect it and change the subject back to the ridiculous, bad point that he was trying to promote. Quote, Putin is bombing apartment buildings in Kyiv. You claim he is justified in doing so because he is troubled by a battalion which has a subset of members with neo-Nazi sympathies stationed 800 kilometers away in Mariupol. That's a question for you to answer, not me. Again, you could add your turn. And then he replies as follows. I never once justified what Putin is doing. I merely pointed out that you're supporting an army with neo-Nazi elements. Try to keep up. Okay, so this is humorous. Again, now he resorts to condescension. Try to keep up, as if I'm having trouble understanding what the exchange is about. The exchange is about Putin invading Ukraine, and this individual trying to justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine by suggesting that Putin is simply concerned with fighting Nazis. And I clearly showed that that's ridiculous, because the subset of people in the battalion who have Nazi sympathies, neo-Nazi sympathies, are 800 kilometers away from where he's directed the primacy of his focus, which is in attacking and capturing Kyiv. And then he also tries to say that I somehow, quote, support an army with neo-Nazi elements, clearly implying that by supporting the Ukrainian army, you are supporting neo-Nazi elements, quote unquote. I mean, it's just an absurd argument, total distraction. But the thing to point out here is, in the midst of the distraction and the condescension of trying to keep up, he actually completely gives up, in essence, his original argument by saying, I never once justified what Putin is doing. Everything else he says after that is you can ignore, because that's irrelevant. The point is that he now concedes or backs into the position that he never actually was justifying what Putin did, which of course is false, because his original tweet said this is who Putin is fighting, and citing giving images of a group with neo-Nazi sympathies and stormtrooper insignia and swastikas. So clearly he was trying to justify Putin's invasion, and now he's trying to claim he didn't. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, is what he's trying to do here. Well, his tweet speaks for itself. So again, I was not going to get distracted by the fact that he was absurdly trying to claim that support for Ukraine is support for Nazis, nor was I going to be distracted by his condescension of trying to keep up. I simply went back to his huge concession that allegedly he was not trying to justify Putin, and I posed him this simple question. I see. So you actually condemn unequivocally Putin's invasion of Ukraine, because he said he wasn't trying to justify what Putin is doing. So presumably that must mean that he in fact condemns Putin's invasion of Ukraine. At this point, I got silence. So I think he had recognized that his silly talking points were not going to make any purchase with me. But had he said, yes, this is his dilemma. Had he said, yes, I do condemn his invasion, we would be back to saying, well, then why did you post this initial thing about Nazi sympathies being the explanation for why he's invading? If he had said, no, I do not support, I do not unequivocally condemn, then we would be back to challenging the justification for invading based upon the absurd claim that there's just one single battalion with a subset of people with neo-Nazi sympathies 800 kilometers away from Kyiv, where the primary fighting has been. Either way, he's got a no-win here, so I understand why he took off. But what I hope happens coming out of this is that he recognized how bad his pro-Russian propaganda is. And this is, to conclude, this is about much more than Kyiv and Russia. What this is about is when you encounter bad arguments and disinformation on the internet, try to take the emotion out of it, try to understand what the main thing is, what the main arguments are, analyze them, and then hammer home your point on those main arguments to unveil and delegitimize bad reasoning.